The year was 1935, and the sun beat down hard on the roof of Cold Mountain Penitentiary. Inside that prison, death row wasn't just a place. It was a path. A long, lime-colored floor they called the Green Mile. And the man in charge of walking inmates down that final stretch was Paul Edgecombe. Paul wasn't the kind of man who liked violence. He did his job with respect and dignity, even when the outcome was grim. He worked alongside a few trusted guards: Brutus Brutal Howell, a big guy with a heart of gold; Harry Terwilliger, smart and firm; and Dean Stanton, young and loyal. But there was one more: Percy Wetmore. Percy had no business being there. He was arrogant, cruel, and proud of his connections. His aunt was married to the governor. He was the kind of man who smiled when people screamed. One hot summer morning, the gates creaked open and a massive truck rolled in. Paul and the team stood by as the new prisoner stepped out. He was enormous, tall, broad, and quiet. His hands were like shovels. His name was John Coffey. Dean whispered, "He's a giant," Brutal said. "Looks like he could lift a horse with one hand." But when John looked up, his eyes weren't hard. They were soft, almost scared. He kept his head low and his voice even lower. "Name's John Coffey. Like the drink, only not spelled the same," he said gently. Paul watched him, unsure. This man was on death row for something horrific. He had been convicted of raping and killing 2 little girls. The evidence? They found him holding their small, lifeless bodies, crying under the rising sun. But something about it didn't sit right with Paul. John didn't act like a murderer. He acted like a man who had lost something. Days passed on the mile. Time was slow. Then one day, a little surprise showed up. A tiny brown mouse scurried across the floor during rounds. The guards chased it, laughing, trying not to trip over each other. Percy tried to stomp on it. But the mouse was fast, clever even, and it somehow became part of the mile. Eventually, the mouse made its way into the cell of a Cajun inmate named Edouard Delacroix. Del took to the mouse like a child to a pet. He named him Mr. Jingles and taught him tricks. Even Paul couldn't help but chuckle when the mouse rolled a thread spool across the floor like a circus performer. It brought some strange comfort to that cold hallway. But Percy didn't like comfort. He hated seeing Del smile. He hated anything that reminded him of softness. And most of all, he hated that he was being ignored. At the same time, Paul was going through something no one could see. A painful bladder infection made every moment a nightmare. He tried to walk it off, tried medicine, but nothing worked. It got worse. The pain became unbearable. One evening, as Paul walked past John's cell, John suddenly stood and reached through the bars. "Boss," he said softly. "Come here." Paul hesitated, but something in John's voice didn't feel dangerous. So he stepped closer. John reached out, wrapped his enormous hands around Paul's groin, and closed his eyes. Paul shouted, tried to pull away, but then something strange happened. A warmth spread through him, not just physical. It felt like light, like something good. Then John gasped, stumbled back, and opened his mouth. A black mist, like a swarm of tiny flies, burst from his throat and disappeared into the air. Paul stood there, heart racing, not knowing what to say, but the pain was gone. The next day, Paul stared at his wife Jan as tears welled in his eyes. "He healed me," he whispered. "That man, he took it from me, like it was never there." Jan looked shaken. "He's on death row, Paul." "I know," Paul said, voice low, "but he's not what they say he is." After that, Paul started to watch John more closely. He noticed how John would pet Mr. Jingles when no one was looking, how he prayed at night in whispers, how he cried sometimes like he could feel the pain of everyone around him. One day, another new inmate arrived, Wild Bill Wharton. Young, dangerous, and completely unhinged. Within 5 minutes of arrival, he pretended to be sedated and then attacked the guards, nearly choking Dean and grabbing Paul's head like a plaything. Brutal knocked him down with a single swing. They chained him up after that. Wild Bill was trouble, and everyone knew it, except Percy, who somehow admired the chaos he brought. But something was about to happen that would prove just how wrong everything was on the mile. That night, Delacroix was scheduled for execution. The team ran through the process. The dry sponge was soaked until Percy stepped forward. He looked at the sponge and deliberately didn't wet it. Paul looked at him. "Percy, you know the protocol." Percy smiled. "Must have slipped my mind." They strapped Dell into the chair, said the prayers, and threw the switch. But something was wrong.
Dell screamed.
His body jerked violently. Flames erupted from his face and scalp. It wasn't quick. It was hell. Everyone watched in horror as the room filled with the smell of burnt flesh. Paul punched Percy later that night. "You did that. You tortured him." Percy smirked. "What are you gonna do, Edgecombe? Fire the governor's nephew." Paul wanted to kill him, but he didn't. He had something better in mind. And that was only the beginning. Paul Edgecombe sat on the porch with his wife Jan, staring at the sunset but lost in thought. "I can't stop thinking about him," Paul said softly. "John Coffey?" Jan asked. Paul nodded. "He's not like the others. I've been doing this job a long time. I've seen men cry, beg, scream, but not like him. He's different. He's gentle." Jan placed her hand on his. "So what are you going to do?" "I need to know more," he replied. "I think we made a mistake." Back at Cold Mountain, the guards were still shaken by what Percy had done to Delegate Mr. Jingles had disappeared into a corner, trembling, lost without his friend. But then, something impossible happened. John Coffey called out, "Boss Edgecombe, bring him here." Paul and Brutal brought the mouse over, barely breathing, body limp. John gently took the little creature in his giant hands and closed his eyes. A light seemed to rise from John's chest again, invisible to the eye but felt in the air. A warm hum of something ancient and pure. Mr. Jingles twitched, then sprang to life. He ran in a perfect circle, backflipped, and rolled the spool again. Dean fell to his knees. "It's a miracle," Paul whispered. "He brought him back." Brutal wiped his eyes and whispered, "What is he?" "I don't know," Paul said. "But he ain't just a man." Later that night, Paul had an idea. Something bold, something no prison guard would ever dare try. "We're taking him out," he said. The others looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "You're talking about breaking a death row inmate out of prison?" Brutal said. "No," Paul replied. "Just for a few hours. I need to show you something." The plan was crazy, but they trusted Paul. The next night, under the cover of darkness, they loaded John Coffey into the prison truck. They drove out to Paul's house. But they didn't stop there. Paul guided them to the home of Hal Moores, the warden of the prison. Hal's wife, Melinda, was dying of a brain tumor. She didn't speak, didn't eat, barely recognized anyone. She was fading fast, lost in her own pain. Hal was hesitant, but Paul looked him in the eyes. "Please, just let him try." They brought John inside. Melinda was in bed, weak and sunken. John slowly knelt beside her, took her face in his hands, and breathed in deep. The room grew quiet. Melinda's body arched. John shuddered and gasped. The black mist poured from his mouth again like before, but heavier, darker. He stumbled back, nearly collapsed. Then Melinda opened her eyes. She looked around, smiled, and spoke clearly. "Where's my watch?" she asked. "I always lose it." Hal dropped to his knees, sobbing. "She's back," he cried. "She's really back." John stood silent, swaying slightly, and then turned to leave. The guards were in awe. "What are we dealing with?" Dean whispered. Paul shook his head. "I don't know if he's a man or an angel or something else, but we're going to kill him." Back at the prison, Paul couldn't sleep. He couldn't stop thinking about the injustice of it all. John Coffey had been convicted of a horrible crime. But now, Paul started asking questions. He visited the files, talked to the sheriff, and started piecing things together. Then he remembered Wild Bill, the lunatic locked in the padded cell. Paul remembered how, during one scuffle, Wild Bill had grabbed him and whispered something strange. "I done things you wouldn't believe, boss." Paul connected the dots. He visited John's cell. "John," he said, "do you know what really happened to those little girls?" John nodded. "I tried to take it back, But I was too late. You saw it? Paul asked. I felt it, John whispered. He was in the woods. That man, Wild Bill. He took them. Both of them. Paul's heart sank. He felt like the floor had dropped from under him. Are you saying Wild Bill Wharton killed those girls? John nodded again, slow, solemn. He hurt them bad, and I couldn't stop him. I tried, but I was too late. Paul staggered out of the cell, blood rushing in his ears. He realized the unthinkable. The man on death row for the crime didn't do it. The real killer was sleeping 2 cells down. He told the other guards. They were furious. But what could they do? There was no evidence. No court would listen. John Coffey was a poor black man with no defense. The world had already made up its mind. Paul paced the mile that night. He looked down the long hallway and realized what it meant to walk someone to death knowing they were innocent. He entered John's cell, sat down quietly. John, he said, I could let you go. We could escape. You don't deserve this. John looked at him, eyes shining. It's okay, boss. I'm tired. I'm tired of all the pain, of feeling people's hurt. It's like pieces of glass inside me. But you didn't do it, Paul argued. You deserve to live. John shook his head. There's too much wrong out there. I can't fix it all. But maybe I can help just one more time. Maybe that's enough. Paul had never cried in uniform before, but he did then. A few days later, they prepared for the final walk. John Coffey asked for one last favor. He wanted to see a movie, so they set up a projector and played a black and white Fred Astaire film. John laughed and clapped his giant hands. That's some magic there, he smiled. Just like heaven must be. When the night came, the chair was ready. The room was full. The witnesses, the warden, the governor's people. All waiting. Paul tried to keep his voice steady. John Coffey, you've been sentenced to death by electric chair. May God have mercy on your soul. John stood tall, looked around, and then quietly asked, Please don't put the hood on me, boss. I'm afraid of the dark. Paul's hands trembled. He nodded, tears falling. They strapped him in. Brutal looked away. The switch was thrown. And just like that, John Coffey was gone. But something in that room stayed behind. Years passed. Paul Edgecombe was no longer a guard. He'd retired, left the prison behind, but not the memories. Those never left. He sat alone most days, feeding Mr. Jingles, who was somehow still alive. Decades had gone by, yet the little mouse hadn't aged. Paul hadn't either, not really. At least not the way a man normally does. One morning, as the sun peeked through the trees, Jan found Paul sitting on the porch, staring into the distance. You thinking about him again? She asked gently. Paul nodded. Every day. Jan sat beside him. You did everything you could, Paul. You gave him peace. Paul looked at her, eyes glassy. But I didn't give him justice. She held his hand. You gave him kindness. That's more than most men ever see. He gave her a sad smile. But it wasn't enough. Jan passed away not long after that. And Paul was left with his thoughts, with the long nights, with Mr. Jingles, who ran in circles and still did that little spool trick. Sometimes Paul would laugh, sometimes cry, sometimes both.